In this episode, we are going to focus on a practical goal that sounds ambitious until you realize it is really just the disciplined application of everything we have built so far. When cloud environments move quickly, it is not enough to hope that every engineer remembers every security rule at the exact moment they are under pressure to deploy. Mistakes are normal, especially when systems are complex and deadlines are real. So the safest environments are the ones that make the risky mistake difficult or impossible to complete. Automated guardrails are controls that stop certain dangerous configurations from ever becoming real, even if someone attempts them by accident. The emphasis here is instant blocking, because the fastest way to reduce risk is to prevent exposure at creation time rather than detecting it hours later. Guardrails do not replace good judgment, but they create a safer default reality where common high-impact errors are caught before they become incidents. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. To make guardrails feel concrete, it helps to distinguish them from monitoring and auditing, which many beginners confuse. Monitoring tells you what happened and may alert you after the fact, while guardrails are designed to prevent specific unsafe actions from succeeding. Auditing provides evidence and accountability, but it often happens after the environment already exists in a potentially risky state. Guardrails operate at decision time, when a resource is being created or modified, and they can deny the change if it violates a rule. This difference matters because cloud risk often comes from short-lived exposures that are still long enough for attackers to notice, especially with automated internet scanning. If a storage bucket becomes public for even a short time, data can be copied quickly and quietly. Instant blocking removes that window, which is why guardrails are such a powerful tool for preventing accidental exposure. Guardrails work best when they focus on a small set of high-impact mistakes that are both common and dangerous. Storage misconfiguration is one of the biggest categories because it can expose sensitive data directly to the internet with surprisingly little effort. A default deny posture means storage should be private unless explicitly and deliberately made public, and a guardrail can enforce that expectation automatically. Beginners sometimes assume storage exposure requires complex hacking, but many breaches are simply the result of a resource being configured for public access without realizing the consequences. Guardrails can block that configuration change immediately, forcing the team to justify and implement any public exposure intentionally. When a system makes unsafe defaults impossible, it reduces both human error and the temptation to take shortcuts. Network misconfiguration is another category where guardrails provide immediate value because networks define what can reach what. A common risky change is opening inbound access broadly, such as allowing access from any internet address to a sensitive port or management interface. Even if authentication is strong, public exposure increases attack pressure and expands risk from scanning, brute force attempts, and vulnerability exploitation. Guardrails can enforce rules that prohibit overly broad inbound access, require private connectivity for internal services, and restrict management paths to controlled entry points. Beginners often think network rules are just connectivity details, but they are security boundaries, and boundary mistakes tend to have large consequences. When guardrails block unsafe network openings, they protect the environment from both accidental exposure and rushed decision-making during outages. Identity and access management, IAM, misconfigurations are especially dangerous because they can create silent, sweeping authority that is hard to notice until it is abused. A common mistake is granting broad administrative permissions to identities that do not need them, or assigning powerful roles at an account-wide scope when a narrow scope would suffice. Another mistake is allowing overly permissive trust relationships, such as identities that can be assumed by unexpected principals. Guardrails can block the creation of identities with excessive privileges, prevent the assignment of risky roles, and require least privilege patterns by default. Beginners sometimes see IAM as complicated paperwork, but in reality, it is the map of power in your environment. Guardrails keep that map from becoming dangerously sloppy. A useful way to think about guardrails is that they encode policy as code into enforcement points that sit directly in the path of change. Policy as code expresses what is allowed and what is not, while guardrails apply those rules automatically when infrastructure changes are proposed. This can happen during deployment pipelines, where changes are evaluated before being applied, and it can also happen at runtime when a change is attempted through a console or automation tool. The key is that evaluation must be immediate and authoritative, so risky configurations cannot slip through during high-pressure moments. Beginners sometimes assume policies are advisory, but guardrails make them operational, meaning the environment itself refuses certain unsafe shapes. This shift from advice to enforcement is what makes guardrails so effective in fast-moving cloud environments. Instant blocking does not mean blocking everything, and a mature guardrail strategy avoids creating a system that is so restrictive that teams are forced into workarounds. The goal is to block the small set of configurations that represent unacceptable risk, while allowing flexibility for legitimate needs through controlled exceptions. Exceptions should be time-bounded, explicitly approved, and logged so they remain intentional rather than forgotten. For example, if a service truly needs a public endpoint, the design should include explicit allow rules and protective controls, and the exception should be documented and reviewed. Beginners sometimes fear guardrails will stop productivity, but well-designed guardrails actually protect productivity by preventing incidents that cause far more disruption than a blocked deployment. Guardrails are most successful when they align with real risk and provide a clear path to do the right thing. Storage guardrails often focus on preventing public exposure, enforcing encryption, and requiring logging for access. Even if a team intends to store only non-sensitive data, accidental mixing happens, and data classification often changes over time. Guardrails that enforce private by default storage and require encryption reduce the chance that a single mistake turns into a data leak. They also standardize expectations across teams, so security posture does not depend on individual knowledge. This standardization is especially important in large environments where many people create storage resources. When every storage resource is forced into a safer baseline, the environment becomes more predictable and easier to monitor. Predictability reduces security noise and helps teams focus on true anomalies. Network guardrails often focus on limiting inbound exposure, requiring segmentation, and enforcing private paths for internal services. For example, guardrails can prevent opening wide inbound rules to sensitive systems, or they can require that management interfaces remain reachable only through controlled pathways. These rules reduce attack surface by making internet-facing exposure an explicit choice rather than an accidental default. They also support layered defense by ensuring that even if one component must be public, others remain protected behind private boundaries. Beginners may assume network design is mostly about performance and routing, but security boundaries are an equal concern, and boundaries are easiest to enforce when they are automated. Guardrails keep network changes aligned with those boundaries. IAM guardrails often focus on preventing privilege escalation through overly broad role assignments or risky trust relationships. For example, guardrails can block attaching administrative privileges to identities that are meant for narrow tasks, or block granting permissions at an account-wide scope when a resource-level scope is available. They can also require that service identities are tied to clear ownership and usage patterns, reducing the risk of orphaned powerful accounts. Beginners sometimes struggle to predict how multiple permissions interact, and that is exactly why guardrails help, because they prevent the worst combinations from being created. By blocking unsafe privilege shapes, guardrails reduce the chance that a single compromised credential becomes an environment-wide takeover. Least privilege becomes enforced rather than aspirational. Logging and visibility are still essential in a guardrail-driven approach because you want to know what was blocked and why. Block events can indicate training needs, confusing workflows, or attempted malicious behavior. They also provide evidence that enforcement is working as designed. A guardrail that blocks risky changes but produces no visible record can create confusion and slow troubleshooting. Clear logs allow teams to understand what rule triggered and how to adjust their deployment safely. Beginners sometimes think enforcement is enough, but enforcement without feedback leads to frustration and workaround culture. Guardrails work best when they teach by making safe paths clear and unsafe paths unworkable. One of the most important benefits of automated guardrails is that they reduce reliance on perfect human behavior, which is unrealistic in complex environments. People get tired, emergencies happen, and the fastest fix often looks like opening access broadly or granting a wide role temporarily. Guardrails protect the environment during those moments by refusing to accept changes that represent unacceptable risk. This is not about distrusting engineers, but about acknowledging that systems should be designed to withstand normal human imperfection. When guardrails exist, teams can still move quickly, but they move within safe boundaries. Safety becomes the default behavior of the system, not a fragile promise. By the end of this episode, the central takeaway is that guardrails are the practical mechanism that turns cloud security principles into immediate outcomes. Storage guardrails prevent accidental public exposure and enforce encryption and logging baselines. Network guardrails block overly broad inbound access and reinforce segmentation and private connectivity for internal services. IAM guardrails prevent excessive privileges and risky trust relationships that could enable privilege escalation. By enforcing these rules instantly, guardrails remove the dangerous window where misconfigurations can be exploited before detection. When guardrails are combined with clear exception handling, strong logging, and consistent policy definitions, they allow cloud environments to move fast without becoming dangerously unpredictable. That is how you keep security aligned with speed in a world where change is constant.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.